Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to LOA Live. For those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit publisher and cultural institution dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture for readers and writers to discover and to rediscover. We're grateful to our partners this evening, the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard, the American Writers Museum in Chicago, the University of Houston, the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, home to James Baldwin's personal archive. A special welcome to Library of America fellows and members who support our mission. In momentous times, our greatest writing speaks to us with new profundity. Deep calls unto deep, as the psalmist says. As the largest civil rights movement in American history has unfolded over the past weeks, the prophetic power of James Baldwin's voice and his searching explorations of race and America's unfulfilled promises have never been more illuminating or more necessary. This evening's event continues Reading James Baldwin Now, a series of engagements with Baldwin's work led by gifted scholars, writers, and teachers. Our focus tonight is the two-part essay memoir, No Name in the Street, published in 1972. Our guest is novelist, playwright, and cultural critic, Daryl Pinkney. No Name in the Street is found in Library of America, series volume number 98, Baldwin's Collected Essays, edited by Toni Morrison, one of 3 LOA volumes collecting Baldwin's essays and fiction. Daryl Pinkney agreed to appear tonight because he told me he's found it impossible these last weeks to get No Name in the Street out of his head. We're incredibly fortunate to have him with us tonight. He is author of 2 novels, High Cotton and Black Deutschland, and 4 works of nonfiction, most recently Busted in New York and other essays. His writing has appeared in New York Review of Books, The New Yorker, Harper's, Slate, The Nation, and many, many other places. His theatrical collaborations with director Robert Wilson have been staged at the Brooklyn Academy of Music and internationally. Daryl will talk for about 25 minutes, then invite your questions. You can submit a question or comment at any time using the Q&A button on your menu bar. If you wish, please let us know where you're viewing from. And now, please welcome Daryl Pinkney.
Thank you. Thank you for having me do this. No Name in the Street and Baldwin in general have been on my mind, and I'm not sure that I'm really explaining why. Maybe just to say what's in this book will give some indication. No Name in the Street, published in 1972, as you said, was James Baldwin's sermon on the reasons for and the consequences of America's failure to embrace the spiritual redemption offered by the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The Library of America, and Mr. Rudin, I hope will forgive me for the moment for remembering the stark jacket design of the original cover, this sort of white typeface that looks like chalk on a solid black background. And on the back, just Baldwin's face, not posed, but close enough to see that his skin is rough and his hair is untended. He's looking past us, his mouth is clamped shut, and no word I can think of would adequately sort of describe the expression on his face, sorrow, hurt, rage, mourning. But back then, you know, this kind of terrifying looking book promised that a terrific moral reckoning awaited within. I'd read Giovanni's Room, novel from the 50s, at a time when I was too young, when I didn't understand why, but my family certainly did. To read Baldwin didn't do anything about adolescent shame and fear in the late 1960s, but his words about men in love revealed the truth and the promise of the desire. I didn't come to his first 2 books of essays, Notes of a Native Son and Nobody Knows My Name, and his first 2 novels, Go Tell It on the Mountain and Another Country, until I was in college. And my memory of reading them is that I read them all at once. In that way, when you're a student, you discover a writer and there's this terrific kind of hypnotic saturation. You're in this big mesmerism festival of falling for the writing, of being changed by the experience of the writer's thoughts, you look up from the page and things are a little different, including you and your insides. And I always think back to this particular passage. It began to seem that one would have to keep in mind or hold in mind forever two ideas which seemed to be in opposition. The first idea was acceptance, the acceptance totally without rancor of life as it is, and men as they are. And in light of this idea, it goes without saying that injustice is a commonplace, but this did not mean that one could be complacent, for the second idea was of equal power, that one must never in one's own life accept these injustices as commonplaces, but must fight them with all one's strength. The fight begins, however, in the heart, and it has now been laid to my charge to keep in my own heart free of hatred and despair. This intimation made my heart heavy, and now that my father was irrecoverable, I wished that he was beside me so that I could search his face for the answers that only the future could give me now. James Baldwin had been famous all of my intellectually conscious life. I'd seen the Dick Cavett show. In 1971, a high school teacher urged on me to read Baldwin's open letter to my sister, Miss Angela Davis, printed in the New York Review of Books. I joined the committee to free Angela Davis as soon as I could. I did not read The Fire Next Time in college. It was enough to know that my grandfather, a minister, loathed it. I did, however, read No Name in the Street around the time that If Beale Street Could Talk, his novel, came out, so probably 1974. I knew that No Name in the Street was Baldwin's answer to The Fire Next Time, his assessment of the movement, which in the early mid-1970s felt as defeated in its limited aims as the revolution had been in its large ones. The Black Panthers had been murdered, imprisoned, exiled. The peaceful mass demonstration seemed worn out as a technique. Dr. King was dead. The politics of nonviolence seemed impossible because of the scale of police violence, the persistence of urban unrest, and the added thing of the nightly images of the Vietnam War. Baldwin had a way of signing off at the end of his books. No Name in the Streets ends with New York, San Francisco, Hollywood, London, Istanbul, St. Paul de Vence, 1961-1971, which always makes me think of James Joyce, Trieste, 1913, things like that. The book only partially accounts for his life, and what was unaccounted for would be taken as part of his sophistication. It's important to remember Baldwin's intellectual glamour in these days. You know, his this kind of riveting, flowing, vulnerable, strangely anachronistic presence. This sort of hip cap. The man had everybody in the same bag. He could say things like that. You think, what? That's Baldwin? Because his speakerly voice on the page was very literary. But when he sort of talked, it was a kind of different thing. You could hear kind of period hipness of the 40s, like when he left the US, in the way that expatriates speak the language they spoke when they left. They somehow don't keep up. It was lost on no one that Reverend King was assassinated exactly 1 year after he made a speech at Riverside Church in 1967, in which he denounced the Vietnam War. Civil rights leaders were supposed to stick to domestic issues and leave foreign affairs alone. This was a holdover from the Cold War, when the Soviet Union would answer US criticism by pointing to racial inequality in the US. To advocate armed self-defense was probably the first thing that brought the Black Panther Party, made it sort of dangerous in the eyes of J. Edgar Hoover and everyone else he had at the FBI. But then the next thing was probably that the Panthers were calling for interracial coalition and international radicalism, a sort of world revolution. They were not Black nationalism. nationalists. And more than that, they were deeply anti-Vietnam War. Between 1967, when Baldwin began to write No Name in the Street, and 1971, when his brother David took away from Baldwin the manuscript he'd managed to accumulate. Nothing about the book, by the way, feels planned or the way it turned out. We now call this kind of sort of non-linear writing, but okay. He was trying to respond to large events that had fallen over us in rapid succession. So the Summer of Love was in 1967, but it was also when Johnson was escalating the war. The Attica prison uprising in New York was in 1971, shortly after the murder of George Jackson in Soledad Prison, an activist at the time. 33 inmates were killed in the Attica in the 4 days of occupation, and 10 prison officials. Angela Davis had been acquitted of murder charges by the time No Name in the Street was published, but Nixon sort of would win that grim November. However, Baldwin wrote No Name in the Street, stop, start, here, there, a long intermission in which we were told he succumbed to depression. He somehow managed to get to the end of the book, a book. Often work is the only answer, and that seemed to be the case for Baldwin, though he put as many obstacles in his way as he could. He was an expert at self-sabotage. But the immediate context mattered. Vietnam, Nixon, Angela Davis, Attica, and the assassinations, so many of them. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Medgar Evers, the NAACP activist in the South. These are the ones who matter most to Baldwin in No Name in the Street. The book shocked many at the time because of what they sort of felt was a change of tone. He'd always held out the threat of moral collapse if America did not atone. And then it turned out America did not care that much about atonement. So his seemingly new vehemence of language spoke not only of his anger, but also of this rhetoric as a kind of front, or so it seemed to me at the time. He'd been at the March on Washington. And in No Name in the Street, he says the March on Washington was a sellout. Again, a few years make a difference, or they made a difference then. So we had Watergate and the Paris Peace Conference, and they seemed to indicate that there were limits to what the nation would tolerate when it came to the uses of state power in its name. However, the end of the draft emptied out the new left, so the interest it had for students and the young people, and the busing backlash had begun. And in 1974, excuse me, the last of the Panther domestic programs or community programs closed in Oakland. I was aware that I was reading about Harlem and that I could hear the gunfire in Harlem in the valley below my dorm over the cliffs of Morningside Park. I was afraid of Harlem, although I had white friends who would let nothing keep them from the Apollo when James Brown was in town. But Baldwin's immediate context was still a militant one in 1974. When I first read No Name in the Street, Toni Morrison was publishing Huey Newton and Angela Davis. Militancy was the news. It was not that Baldwin's militancy seemed already obsolete to me or even utopian, but it involved a compromise that he chose to make in order to stay on the side of that revolution, to keep the focus on Black suffering and not on his particular injuries. So the book opens this strange kind of establishment of who he is, and part of the torment of the book has to do with his relation to his privileges compared to those of Black people sort of more circumscribed. And so it opens with a very weird story about a suit. Baldwin recalls that when he was to appear with King at Carnegie Hall in 1968, he got fitted for a dark suit. 2 weeks later, he wore that suit to King's funeral. He never appeared with him. He remarked to a columnist that he would never be able to wear that suit again. Not long after, he got a call from an old friend, a US postal worker he'd known very well when they were in junior high school, but he hadn't really seen him much since then. The guy had seen the article, and because they were the same size, Baldwin's very small, he asked for the suit. And to Baldwin, this suit was drenched in the blood of the crimes of the country. Nevertheless, he took it in a hired Cadillac limousine uptown to Harlem. He rented limousines because he didn't want to go through the humiliation of having taxis not stop for him or refuse to take him to Harlem. So he came in to this unspeakably respectable apartment of his old friends, church people, and he felt he was bringing the odor of champagne and brimstone. Um, uh, and he hadn't seen them since he left home and the church, and what he called a deliberate repudiation of everything and everyone who had produced him up until that moment. And he said that in a way, he would never be able to make real to his countrymen or to himself that because he had made it, he felt that he had betrayed the people who had produced him. It's very weird, this guilt, but it sort of opens up on, what a star he was at the time. Sorry, they told me not to read, to keep looking at the camera, but I can't wing it. I have to try and organize my thoughts, and even these thoughts aren't so organized, but here we go on. So, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, founded in 1966 by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, young Black revolutionary socialists, as they describe themselves. They were the reason Reagan changed the gun laws in 1967 about you could carry a gun or a shotgun so long as it wasn't concealed. That same year, Aldrich Cleaver joined the party, sort of 6'5", green-eyed convict. And in 1968 came the police shootout in Oakland, in which Cleaver was wounded, 2 officers were wounded, and a young 17-year-old party member, Bobby Hutton, was killed. Cleaver jumped bail as Soul on Ice was hitting the bestseller list. By the way, it got a respectful review in the New York Review of Books, and in the same review, Baldwin's novel, Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, was treated rather roughly. And Cleaver ended up in Algeria. The FBI and Pro had done its work, and Cleaver and Hugh Newton had a spectacular feud and split, and Cleaver was kicked out of the party in 1971. For years, the notorious chapter that had been published in Ramparts in 1966, in which Cleaver claimed that Baldwin's frustration was that he was unable to have a baby by a white man, was the only part of Soul on Ice I'd read, and I need to read more. In No Name in the Street, Baldwin doesn't answer Cleaver, how could he? So much as he makes it clear that rather than take on Cleaver, who by that time was on the road to ruin anyway, he didn't want to be distracted. And the greater crime was what white America had done to produce Black men like Cleaver. And so he kept faith with the Panthers, largely because of Huey Newton. But in No Name in the Street, he goes on a great deal about the price of Black manhood and its location in a Black man's balls, his balance because of his balls. This didn't seem like Baldwin at all, but all of this Michelle Wallace would really kind of come to grips with in Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman when it appeared in 1979. Wallace argued that attacks by militants like Amira Baraka and Cleaver on Baldwin for being what they called the darling of the white liberals and the great Black hope sort of made Baldwin choose to forget himself and toe the militant line of the time. It was probably more that Baldwin, being the most famous Black writer since Richard Wright, the ambition of Cleaver and Baraka was sort of aimed at him to kind of get him out of the way. So was it a sacrifice or trying to remain relevant? And back then, spokespeople and writers sometimes woke up to the news that they were no longer relevant. But Baldwin had principles no matter the cost. And this trust in him, even at corners we wish we weren't finding him on, is partly why he speaks so much to us now. He also refused to repudiate Malcolm X. He understood and was very candid about how much bitterness the Black poor harbored. Why else was white America so afraid? In Angela Davison's Autobiography, published in 1974, Davis was determined not to see herself as singular or exceptional. She is part of a collective effort. Everything is in the name of the many working for social justice. In No Name in the Street, there was a very touching moment when Baldwin remembers King's modesty, his refusal to speak of himself his absolute focus on others. And Baldwin in the book declines to call himself a spokesman, but he describes himself as a public witness to the Black situation. And it's a kind of modesty of his own because he has sort of put his great gifts in the service of Black people. And the debate at that time was very much, he'd given up his art for politics. And I don't know if we still make that same kind of division. Anyway, but his strategy in No Name in the Street is to call himself names early on. So he goes to this apartment of his old friend and calls himself an aging, lonely, sexually dubious, politically outrageous, unspeakably erratic freak. And he leaves the question hanging in the air as to whether being an outsider isn't an advantage when it comes to his perspective. By the time Cleaver comes up at the end of the book, Baldwin has come across as much too complex for him to hold. And so his relationship to the Black Panther Party and his response to Cleaver remind us that he is not a spokesman or even a sacrifice. He's a writer, and one who can sound very intimate when he's at his most impersonal. Very much so in Baldwin, writing is thought, but language is performance. What troubled me in No Name in the Street when I read it back then in my days of high culture and popular culture was that he sort of said the bankruptcy, or he said very clearly the bankruptcy of the West was such that it made him feel distanced from its culture, that he couldn't appreciate Shakespeare or Bach or Rembrandt or the Stones of Paris or the cathedral at Chartres. And, you know, most white people can't either or don't bother to. And something he said before in the preface to Notes of a Native Son, he goes on about sort of saying things, Chartres isn't mine, like he'd never read Henry Adams or something like that, and Shakespeare isn't, and my past leads to Africa, not Europe. These monuments do not contain my history. And that sort of speaks to what's going on now. And my education, my parents, the point was, don't let anyone intimidate you, keep you out, say you don't belong, or this is not for you, especially when it comes to beautiful, to what is beautiful, which every life should have, no matter where they find it or what they find beautiful. And so this stance of his always struck me as a kind of false position, even though he didn't really have much visual culture. And so I'm doing that page thing they told me not to do. Pretend I'm not. Just pretend I'm still talking to you. I remember an essay from 1964. It's in that Cross of Redemption, his uncollected, called Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare. I mean, I remember the title. I never could deal with it. It just seemed too Philistine. It's not Shakespeare's fault that he's badly taught or done in America. Well, anyway. After Baldwin's death in 1987, we, or I, divided his work into two phases, early and late. And the revelatory subtleties belong to the first phase, I said, and the strident repetitiveness to the exhaustion of the last phase. It had something to do with his rhetorical strategies. Early on, he would speak of America and then say we are what we needed to do. By the time we get to No Name in the Street, there is no more we. He doesn't even say blank as we. There's just two sides. It's sort of what we would say binary. Okay. Because most of us didn't want to hear it anymore, we said that there had been a falling off in his work on a literary level. David Leeming, in his biography, would tell us soon enough that actually No Name in the Street, trying to write about what had happened to him and to the country in the 60s, put him on the road to recover from trauma, was his recovery from trauma. He says early on in the book, something has happened to me since since Martin Luther King's death. Something in me has altered, something has gone away. These were his Istanbul years in which he was writing No Name in the Street, and they would lead on to St. Paul de Vence. And then in the 1970s, he would go on to write a lot. He had sort of recovered. Nevertheless, it was the fashion to say, well, he wasn't what he used to be, because No Name in the Street is something that really asked too much of us, and we were on to other things or wanted to be. Frederick Douglass revised his autobiography 3 times, and Baldwin, the autobiographical essayist, did a lot of that himself. Um, uh, um, Pretend I'm not shuffling pages. After he tells the story about the weird suit and his guilt, he leaves Harlem in 1968 and goes back to Harlem in 1948, the scene of many of his earlier essays. If I had not gone mad, I could not have left. And then he goes on to his starving years in Paris. And then he goes on to when he first came back to the US in 1952, all things he had written about before. So, and this time in No Name in the Street, when he remembers coming back to the United States in 1952, it's McCarthyism very much that he remembers, a foul, ignoble time. And my contempt for most American intellectuals and or liberals dates from what I observed of their manhood then, again, that word. McCarthyism was among the reasons Baldwin wanted to develop as a writer outside the US, he said. Some blacks had inglorious moments at HUAC hearings. But for Baldwin's purposes, McCarthyism is a white people's story. What they did to one another, he says, was worse than what they had ever done to him. No Name in the Street opens with this suit and goes back to Paris. And you could sort of, all this stuff, you could sort of say that either he was making himself more radical than he was, or he was able to talk about things at last that he'd not been able to. For instance, Baldwin gives the impression in No Name in the Street that when he was first in Paris, he belonged to a self-conscious third world community. In the early writings, it's all sort of cafes, and you sort of think people are sort of bohemian and white. Okay. But in No Name in the Street, he goes back and remembers early Paris, and that his friends during this uncertain time have been Algerian. He says that when he comes back from the US in 1952, the Algerian cafes had been closed and his friends had disappeared. He knew then he could no longer, well, anyway, he sort of identified more with the Arabs and the Algerians because his history, like theirs, was the result of European involvement in Africa. And then also he goes on to sort of remember, to revise what he'd written about before about touring the South in 1957. And there's this shocking detail that in No Name in the Street that this one guy, a state official he'd gone to see, actually groped him, which gives him another opportunity to talk about black manhood and white manhood. And it was very much the thing at that time to accuse white men of not having any because they had to hide behind sort of apparatus of oppression. I don't know. And sort of there in a way that once he sort of gets there, the chronology of No Name in the Street breaks off. The second part is rather different because it's about a friend, well, a former employee and casual friend named Tony Maynard, who in this period was charged, arrested for murder in New York City, and jumped bail and fled to Germany. And Baldwin then begins the long process of trying to help him through the judicial system and to be exonerated, which he eventually was. And you can sort of feel in this story the beginnings of the novel If Beale Street Could Talk, was made into that Barry Jenkins film, which is about a family struggle with the judicial system and the police. A second part of No Name in the Street also takes in his work on a screenplay for the film of the autobiography of Malcolm X. And you get some intimation of what a diva he was, and you're not so surprised he had troubles with Columbia Studios and the project fell apart. But it had a vindication of the kind in that when Spike Lee made his film with Malcolm X, he used some of Baldwin's material. And then there was this other project called Remember This House, about the martyrs of the freedom struggle. For him, again, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Medgar Evers. but he never wrote it. And in a way, No Name in the Street is that book. But then there was also a 30-page proposal, Remember This House, that Raoul Peck used as the basis for his extraordinary documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, released in 2017. Of Baldwin's published work, Peck draws primarily from the late phase, No Name in the Street and The Devil Finds Work, which was Baldwin retelling his autobiography by remembering and reviewing the films he saw growing up. It's a strange work. Even after we admire how well Peck has selected from these books, the documentary goes on to give his words a tone I never associated with this late phase. His words come across in the film as calm, very calm, and maybe this is Samuel Jackson's voice, but a lot of it is Baldwin himself with a strange kind of incantatory way he had of speaking. And his conclusions are rueful and his ironies all slow burn. The Baldwin most quoted these days comes from the work once thought of as his weary end. Instead, it's this kind of exciting new beginning. Baldwin used Dostoevsky in No Name in the Street to say he no longer believed in the wagons that brought bread to humanity. The dismissal of Western humanism that I once found so shocking and threatening, it seems such a part of the angry rejection, prefigures or is echoed in the language about systemic racism. Because Baldwin also, though he dwelled on the inner life, the soul, the mind, he was trying to say that white and black were the products of a long history, that this just didn't happen, and that no one was unaffected by it. Except it's important to remember that also, and above all things, the freedom of Baldwin's vocabulary, No Name in the Street, reprimands the censors among us and within us. He always wrote with a total freedom. It's the only way he could do it. So there are words in there that you couldn't teach in a classroom now, okay? Ishmael Reed long ago observed that black people knew that what Baldwin was talking about, that they knew it, and they also knew that he was explaining it to white people, not to them. So he says, Baldwin says things like, white Americans are probably the sickest and certainly the most dangerous people of any color to be found in the world. Which is the kind of thing he never said in print before No Name in the Street, at least not in book form. This kind of statement, his kicking at the chicken shit goodwill of America, it's part of what brought to my mind No Name in the Street during these last weeks of protests. This book, and though he never says vote, there is something in it. And it is something I never paid attention to before because of what Reed talked about. That part wasn't talking to me, or I didn't sort of take it in, or I sort of wrote it off as just the way people talked. This critique of whiteness, things like, and here I'm not going to pretend I'm not, the failure of the private life has always had the most devastating effect on American public conduct and on black-white relations. If Americans were not so terrified of their private selves, they would never have needed to invent and could never have become so dependent on what they still call the Negro problem. This problem which they invented in order to safeguard their purity has made of them criminals and monsters, and it is destroying them. And this not from anything blacks may or may not be doing, but because of the role and guilty and constricted white imagination has assigned to blacks. The sort of language is really rather sort of different, but he's done with the lie of pretended humanism. Baldwin always tried to keep a global perspective in mind for the American racial situation. And so No Name in the Street ends with, you know, his thoughts on maybe a sort of socialist future, not terribly convincing in that way. I think of Baldwin's, oh, am I rolling around? Okay. There's a new book called Begin Again, Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own by Eddie S. Glaude Jr. And I was very drawn to this book because in it he insists that No Name in the Street, Baldwin never gave up on America. Baldwin, sort of kept going on. And so I kept thinking of this line from Job, they that come after him will be astonished at his day.
Daryl, thank you. I mean, you've opened up a million avenues to pursue.
Well, that's
And it's
also Baldwin.
fascinating talk. Yes, indeed.
There's something all over the place.
And we have some questions from the viewers. And before we jumped in, I wanted to ask you one of my own, which is just to ask you, what kind of book you think this is? I mean, there are all these signals that it's either a conversion narrative or an ironic conversion narrative. I mean, there are these titles, Take Me to the Water, To Be Baptized. The epigraph to the second part is, I told Jesus it would be all right if he changed my name. And obviously names and changing of names is a huge motif, to say the least, in this book, not only Baldwin himself, but and in Malcolm X, obviously, but name changing in general. And the conversion thing makes you think, of course, of the church and of Baldwin's language and how the language of the Black church undergirds Baldwin's work, at least in the early phase. Now, so my question really is, what's going on here? I mean, because there's those signals that it's a conversion narrative, and yet what kind of liberating truth, what kind of dark, bitter consciousness does he come to? You know what I mean? How do those things play off each other? How do you read the book in a way? And how do you read his framing it with these allusions to conversion and to name change?
I think that's what I meant when I said that I don't know if the book came out as he had planned, because the epigrams and the titles suggest something ambitious relating to this Old Testament feeling of conversion, ignorance, being tested. That's all witnessing. All of this is wrapped up in Baldwin as these kind of, he moved a church language into the secular world, like Aretha singing church music to a secular beat or something like that. You know what I'm trying to say? Mm-hmm. That was always, I think, a part of him and a part of his inspiration. He was drawn to this exalted language. And then, he sort of, Mary McCarthy once sat on a committee with him and was surprised by how literary he was, which some of his friends would find rather insulting, since he had very slashing opinions. He changed his mind about Faulkner in the book, and he never liked Scott Fitzgerald, which is a surprise, but things like that. So, but I think of the book as it is a conversion narrative in that he is siding with a kind of Black militancy, which in 1972 is imperiled. Mm-hmm. And the book ends with material that was actually among the first stuff he wrote as a review of Soul on Ice that was never published. So I think that the struggle he had to write the book is very visible in the form. And what we call nonlinear is our way of kind of forgetting the human struggle that produced this thing, not exactly according to plan. So the first part has a definite tone and sustained sense of argument. And the second part sort of feels like it's groping, trying to find him in the story, because as the story moves on, he himself was more all over the place. And there's this strange way he has of, I'm talking too much, so I'll stop.
No, not at all. Fascinating.
I'm talking too much.
Well, I want to ask you, just to follow up, that you were talking about the form of the book, which is kind of impressionistic and, as you say, non-linear and kind of recursive. It keeps going back to the same spots of time, whatever you want to call them, these moments that are either like trauma returning to something or returning to understand it in different ways. But the other element of that, and this is, I wanted to ask you this because you're a novelist and you're an essayist. The book obviously has these different elements. It has essayistic elements and these novelistic scenes that are fascinating. It has the Coney Island swimming scene, which resonates with Take Me to the Water. It has the young man who goes mad, who visits him in Beverly Hills. It has different white girlfriends, one of whom slaps him in Washington Square. They're well, friends. There are these, but there are these novelistic scenes that are part of the way the book works out its effects. And I was curious what you how you think about that. How does Baldwin see them working in this book? And also, which ones for you do you find the most haunting when you finish reading?
Huh. Well, it's all Baldwin. I used to say Baldwin's voice never aged, but that's not quite true. His voice had two stops, that of the young man and that of the older man who looked back and said the young man was right. You look at his writing and, personal stuff, sexual issues is in the fiction. The nonfiction tends to be public, even when he's speaking in the first person, which is all the time. He's a kind of black everyman. It's only when he has to say something slightly in a dissenting mode or mood, especially about, say, sex, that that you sort of feel he's not speaking for everyone or not trying to look at the situation for everyone. That's personal. But the interesting thing about Baldwin is that he used his young life and then not the rest. His life as a star is not in his essays, beyond saying, I ran into Sidney Poitier on his way to another civil rights gig like me. But he doesn't put that in, and that is his guilt. It's there in the sense that he doesn't think about it, but he says, I was in Puerto Rico when I heard that Medgar Evers was killed. I was in London when I heard that Malcolm X was killed. I was in Palm Springs with Billy D. Williams when I got the call that Martin Luther King was killed. His adult life or his life as a writer is in that kind of schedule, but his private life is sort of not there. And so he retells what are to him his own foundational myths. And I think the one that gets me the most is that one about swimming with the older brother, the older half brother, off Long Island. Because in his last novel, Just Above My Head, this very scene returns and is sort of expanded and written out. And his biographers would make a connection of this guy being the original model of the protector, the big brother, a kind of what Baldwin was looking for in love. So I think that motif certainly strikes me. But it's all true. It all comes from his life. He just kept looking at it in different ways, but only his early life. And that's the odd thing about him. It's his privacy, which you think he had.
Well, we have some questions from our viewers.
Okay.
There are quite a few Francophiles among them.
Okay.
And so I'm going to group a couple of these questions together. Library of America board member Edwin Matthews, writing from Connecticut, says, why did Baldwin feel the need to emigrate to France, and how did France change him? Grace Nichols asks, she says, I'm fascinated by the expatriate experience in Europe and how it helped Baldwin recover from being an American and the injury to him of that. And Thomas Anderson asks, how are books like Giovanni's Room still relevant to us? So I think those are all kind of, in a way, similar questions.
Interestingly enough, Baldwin went to DeWitt Clinton and Bronx. He went to very good schools. He had County Cullen as a French teacher in junior high school, but the Harlem Renaissance impinges nowhere on his writing, not in his writing on Harlem, not in his writing on Black literature. There's no Harlem Renaissance, really. It was Richard Wright who I think was his model, as Richard Wright moved to Paris in 1947 because he had a Jewish wife and mixed race kids, and Brooklyn was impossible, even Brooklyn at the time, 1947, 1948. So he moved to Paris. And this seemed to Baldwin a way to save himself and become a writer. So he got a fellowship and he moved to Paris with $9 or whatever it was. And then you have to remember that when he went to Paris, so was everybody, because it had been closed off for a long time, not only because of the war, but even before, because of the turmoil in Europe, especially after 1937. The exchanges with Europe were only just beginning to happen again. The first Matisse show in New York wouldn't happen until 1951. And so when Baldwin went to France, he also went under the spell of the Mathewson book on Henry James. And Giovanni's Room is really the only book, only novel of his that so clearly follows a pattern of a Henry James novel through the seasons and along the same themes. It was a long-standing tradition among Black writers that you got away from America and were able to reflect on it in the way that Henry Louis Gates Jr. once said that the sheer existence of a slave narrative told you that the ending had been a success, that the enslaved person had freed himself and got away to somewhere where he could look back. And something of that operated in expatriatism. There have been Blacks in Europe for 500 years, but American Blacks in Europe, especially after the fugitive slave law, when people like Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown took themselves to England to sort of get away. The writer Charles Chestnut at the turn of the 20th century was offered a place in Europe where a Black guy like him could sort of live unmolested. It was like passing, an individual solution, but not a problem, not a solution to a mass problem. And so writers had a kind of personal freedom. And even though Paris was the capital of an empire, you as an American, a Black American, were unmolested. Ralph Ellison said he got sick of hearing what a kind of paradise Paris was just because you could sit at a table with a white woman. But you know, actually, that was a pretty big deal, this kind of personal freedom. So I think that Baldwin was looking for that and found it, didn't always know what to do with it because his life would be different from everyone else's, you know, just from the fact of being gay. And the odd thing about Giovanni's Room is that it's very mean to certain kinds of gay people, older ones, effeminate ones. Baldwin had his ideal that he sort of never really, I don't know. Well, that's not fair. I don't know everything. But he had an ideal in that book. And it's a strange book that it has this rather ridiculous frame of the 1950s dime store steamy bestseller. And within it, Baldwin's lyric gift are on display like nowhere else. And in a way, I think his great tragedy was, as a writer, he had this beautiful lyrical small, gift but because something like Another Country had been such a big bestseller, he was doomed to keep trying to write these big bestsellers. That wasn't really the way he thought, certainly not in fiction. But all these guys, Norman Mailer, Styron, they were all looking for the great American novel, and he was the only Black writer at the time in that league. Talking too much again.
No, it's very good. I was just thinking that there's another question, and I think it actually relates, right? It relates to the Paris material and the book that you were just talking about. I mean, the two things that happen in France in this book are the falling in love, which he says that the nakedness that required of him changed everything for him, and that the quarrels that lovers have no color, he says, or worse to that effect. But the other thing that happens is, as you were saying earlier, the identification with the Algerians, which is all about choosing sides. And so there are these two, there's like the public and the private, there's these two things pulling against each other, or maybe they're not pulling. But Brian Williams, who's from Auburn University, asks, and this was making me think of that, he says, thank you very much. Baldwin presents an overwhelming totality of systematic oppression, yet the word love is everywhere in his text. And his tone, though understandably smoldering, also seems hopeful. What do you think Baldwin's hope is for America, his vision of the inevitable? I mean, obviously that's the big question, but I'm curious about how the love and that scene of love in Paris, how does that work with what he learns about, Algeria and how does that play out in the book, those things?
I think Baldwin always hoped that people would be able to save themselves, that they would find a degree of life, even within imperfect or brutal systems, and that this finding yourself or committing yourself to higher purposes helped to change society from within. Hannah Arendt warned him after the March on Washington that in world politics, there is no place for love, and that liberators made very terrible governors. But it was not something Baldwin was willing to give up on. And I think it's related to the Black religious tradition as well, in the sense of beloved. And of course, the post-war pacifist philosophy that Dr. King was educated in from Howard Thurman and others at Howard and Boston, that, you know, it was a better weapon, or a more powerful one in the end. And it was also very disarming and disconcerting to find in this militant rhetoric this word. Something that he got from King, I thought, as well.
That's very good. A number of the questions are about, you know, the role of the writer. I think you were talking about this earlier as well. Rochelle Goldstein asks, can you talk about Baldwin's relationship to Richard Wright? That's one kind of question. Imani Gomez-Smith asks, given the state of Black people in America today, what would be Baldwin's call to arms for the creative community? And I guess really it's a large question about what is the writer's role in all this, and in this book, and in your view. I mean, this also goes to the part about Eldridge Cleaver in the book, where there's this uneasiness between the two of them, and Baldwin points out that not only is there something odd and uncomfortable in the relationship of the revolutionary and the artist, but there's something odd and uncomfortable and sharp in each's relationship to the public that they are working to serve. And so there's this idea of this uneasiness of like activist, writer, public. And I guess in moments of great change. I guess I'm curious, you know, how you think, you know, Baldwin thinks about that in this book, and what does it mean to you, let's say now, to, you know, to think about that?
Well, you think back to the landscape, well, not old enough, of the 1960s. We have Baldwin now in a kind of isolation that he did not exist in at that time. You know, there were many, many voices and personalities and organizations. I won't say they were competing for our attention, but they were all sort of offering answers on a spectrum that ranged from, you know, we say nonviolent to violent, but reform to revolution, all these things. And Baldwin had a rather ad hoc and free relationship to all these things because he wasn't in an organization, though they say he worked with SNCC and CORE, and he says, I was a Trotskyite early on. He never had this kind of organizational identity. It was always the writer, the artist. This was the only coat he needed. He, early on in his career, he was going to be art for art's sake is a vulgar way to put it, but he was going to be like Ralph Ellison was late in life, only interested in writing and not going to let anything distract him from that. And he knocked Richard Wright, who had been a kind of a father figure or helper. I don't like that word mentor, but you know, had really brought Baldwin along as he had Ralph Ellison. And Baldwin denounced Native Son, and in a way that really much hurt Richard Wright. In Nobody Knows My Name, there's a very haunting portrait that Baldwin gives of Richard Wright in his last years of exile in Paris. Alas, poor Richard, this isolated figure that no one's talking to in the Café Tournon, because Wright was a difficult figure. But again, before Baldwin, Richard Wright's fame was unlike anything any Black writer had experienced. You could almost sort of these peaks, Richard Wright, James Baldwin. Ralph Ellison was a very special case because of the distinction of Invisible Man. But Toni Morrison was sort of, you know, this kind of culmination of this. Although I noticed they never asked her what she thought about anything because they already knew the answer or they were afraid of it. and the times meant you couldn't help but be drawn into it, because if your subject matter as a writer is Black life, suddenly all this happens. And there it is again. I think that in this moment, there are so many voices. And just as we don't have the need for a Black leader because everyone is a leader now, given just the way things are going, or articulate in that way, there's so many things happening on so many different fronts that's unimaginable or wasn't the same back then. It's just that everything that was sort of on the fringes in the 60s and the 70s is now in the mainstream. And that's sort of what has happened. Everything that used to be fringe discussion, like reparations as part of the Black National Convention in 1972, is part of mainstream discussion. And so one of the things we must remember is that since No Name in the Street, 50 years have gone by. And so there is a great deal of change, but not enough, and perhaps not deeply enough. Du Bois said, the history of the world is a very good novel, even if you don't get to read the end.
I think that's a good place to end. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry I talked so much and bobbed around.
It was really terrific.
Wherever you begin with Baldwin, it's worth it, because it'll take you on to something else. And thank you very much for letting me
Thank you so much.
Go on and on and on and on. You're very kind. And good evening to everyone.
You've all been listening to Daryl Pinkney discuss James Baldwin's No Name in the Street, published by Library of America in James Baldwin's collected essays, edited by Toni Morrison. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Tuesday, July 28th, Joanne Freeman, professor of history at Yale and editor of Library of America's edition of Alexander Hamilton's writings, a book Lin-Manuel Miranda had at his side while writing Hamilton, will discuss the musical, now Disney movie, and the history behind it. What does it get right? What does it get wrong or ignore? What does it tell us about how American history is made and remade? Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's James Baldwin and Alexander Hamilton editions and links to purchase those and other volumes of great American writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thank you so much again to Daryl Pinkney, and have a great evening.